December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Innovation is a hell of a thing. In modern times, you hold a device in your hand that is capable of speaking to objects in space, has the processing capacity many times that of those who put objects on the moon and split the atom, and has the largest available sum of human knowledge ever recorded. In modern times, something as simple as basic rifle optics would be derided as black magic a mere few decades ago. But there's also a lot that can be said about when an innovator or a design team gets something exactly right the first time. The M-2 50 caliber machine gun is more than just a small arm. It's a light cannon capable of taking out vehicles, stalling entire advances by its mere presence alone, is near single-handedly responsible for every major advance or territory gain that the United States military has ever made, never being reversed. It's been used on the ground, in the air, on the water, in heroic defenses, and supported massive offensives. In modern-day vehicle-mounted solutions, it is capable of tracking, firing on, and hitting individuals or aircraft from well over a mile away. And while previous stories of triumph, bravery, and destruction of evil powers are constantly highlighted throughout history, a rare few weapon systems accompanied them all. This is the story of the Modular. In 1918, the American Expeditionary Force under the command of General John Pershing requests a light anti-aircraft gun so that soldiers on the ground could defend themselves against the ever-increasing threat of a rapidly evolving industry of new war machines that could contest and therefore control the very air you breathe. In addition to modern fighters and reconnaissance aircraft becoming a greater and greater nuisance, World War I era, especially German bombers, were starting to get quite large with ever-increasing capabilities, considering the immense bravery required to fly and fight in such machines. Never mind the prevalence and therefore the need to knock down observation balloons during this era. In addition to this, the emerging and increasing threat of tanks also posed a particular threat to ground troops. While Germany and Austria did not possess large quantities of them, Britain, France, and by extension America did, which would dictate wisdom. Line officers and therefore command officers of the time made the simple assumption that these would be a future and more aggressive threat than what was in the last war, so military planners at the time saw the need for line infantry to have a means of defense against these new technologies, and how right they were could not be overstated. Originally conceptualized from the Browning 1917 water-cooled 30 caliber machine gun, officially adopted in 1922, this new tool would originally be made as a water-cooled, and I'm using rather large quotations here, lighter profile-barreled machine gun. The first working prototype would be taken from request and concept drawing in April of 1918 to tripoded and firing prototype in November of 1918. This short development time is no small feat, as scaling up a 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun to a safe working prototype while working in conjunction also with Colt and Winchester, who is developing and manufacturing ammunition for it, can be an insanely dangerous endeavor even for the time. With basic and comparatively primitive tools and manufacturing processes, without several strokes of genius injected in said process, we have several extremely dangerous factors to consider, considering that at this point, nobody on the planet has successfully or safely made a high-pressure, high-velocity, belt-fed machine gun meant to sustain accurate fire against infantry and vehicles for long periods. Now, lower-velocity 11mm machine guns and even low-velocity shrunken cannons have been made to knock down balloons up to this point, and the Germans had a large-bore anti-tank rifle that they wanted to turn into a machine gun. But up to this particular point, nobody has ever successfully made a large-bore high-velocity machine gun for sustained defense, or ass-kicking. This is especially concerning, considering the fact that this new machine gun would originally be designed to use a 709.5 grain boat-tailed steel core projectile, which is the length of your thumb, with what equates to a quarter stick of dynamite sent at 2,810 feet per second with the express purpose of smashing anything it comes into contact with. So in reality, this isn't even really a machine gun. What it is, in all frankness, is a light man-portable cannon. This can obviously get quite dangerous if you are lazy at any point during the design phase, particularly with the math. But the incredible thing about this endeavor is that crazy people that also happen to be extremely intelligent as well as observant have a tendency to make very complex machines in equally incredibly simple ways. For instance, the moving components were far less complex than many of the designs of the time. Rather large, reliable in function, and easy to produce even in its original configuration. And so truly, this was a way forward as far as weapons design. So in short order, thousands were ordered into mass production by the United States government. But if you're keeping track of timelines, this is when World War I suddenly ends, deleting all of those orders, which results in only one branch of service taking this thing seriously in any real quantity, and even those quantities were very small. And of all places, the U.S. Coastal Artillery places orders for large enough quantities of this 100-pound water-cooled anti-aircraft gun to suit its very, very few needs, which leads us to the interwar period of this new weapon's life. An interesting thing tends to happen when wars conclude themselves. When the sound dies down and the blood dries, there seems to be this sense of knowledge loss and period of perfect first suggestion that tends to happen in military minds. Complaints by people who have and never will see a battlefield of their own volition that would during an actual war be discarded as useless suggestions badly written on paper that nobody reads, have a tendency to be taken quite seriously by people who have discarded the lessons painfully learned by the men who did their fighting for them. This thought virus also has a tendency to spread its way to every branch of military service, the Congress, enthusiasts, and on the problems persist. This is how you get things like a lack of naval torpedo live fire testing, even though this is the primary armament of most things with anti-ship capability. And of course, this is just a minor example. We see this kind of nonsense throughout history and today from people who have never lived outside against their will in their lives, carrying tools that are designed to destroy cardboard instead of people, that get winded from an aggressive ascent up a flight of stairs. And so, summarized is the following list of complaints from across military service branches and their leadership at the time. While the firepower, range, and insane reliability of this system is completely unmatched by anything presently in service and gives our soldiers unprecedented material advantage over every adversary nation on Earth, we believe the weight, muzzle blasts, weight, lack of left or right hand feed options, the weight, present need to teach our people how to keep the gun on target rather than have a perfectly flat shooting gun, and of course the weight, are too much a concern to order or field this machine gun that hurts our ego more than our targets on our ranges at this time. It's interesting how things are cyclical in nature, and how an obsession over optimal or perfect based on the slow-minded thought process of a few generally hampers capability throughout interwar periods, forcing drastic cover downs once a genuine war actually does break out, but I digress. This would lead to a grand total of barely 11,000 units of this particular machine gun being sold across the world, and only in its water-cooled and anti-aircraft configuration during this interwar period. But John Moses Browning and the now growing list of Colt and Springfield engineers that are persistently developing this machine gun for a war they can see coming are smart. These people would not simply move on to the next design, as this was seen as a true war winner if adopted en masse. The present issue was to simply make it appealing for that mass. Principally, how do we make this attractive to every customer for qualities it has outside of what it can flatly deliver? Well, the next step was to make this appealing to logistics chains, and in 1933 a development was made that would go almost completely unchanged for nearly a century. Dr. Samuel Green, a project manager and engineer at Springfield, discovered, shared, and got approved sweeping changes to the presently designated 1921 Browning machine gun that would turn it into the monster we know of today. The first of many changes would be to cam the charging handle, cutting the significant amount of force required to charge the machine gun by nearly half. And while this was already enough to catch some attention from prospective buyers, he didn't stop there. Addressing the previous concerns of mostly vehicle crews, enormous changes were made to the moving components of the 1921, allowing for quick and painless conversion to left or right-hand feed. This addresses spatial concerns in a mostly ignorant time for vehicle combat in which nobody really knew what the fuck they wanted or needed, which in the realm of military procurement happened to be two different things. In addition to this, the receiver itself was changed quite dramatically to what was termed as a universal receiver in front trunnion, meaning without any sophisticated tools, you can quite easily change the gun from a water-cooled configuration to an air-cooled configuration and back again. Formally designated the M-2 and combined with modern industrial capacity and assembly lines prefabbing individual parts, this big bastard can be whatever you wanted it to be now. And with the portent of war beginning to show itself on the horizon, later beginning in earnest in 1939, this incredible flexibility would be tested like no other small arm in human history before or since. Three major configurations of the M2 resulted from these 1933 changes. The water-cooled variant, which was primarily used for surface-to-air defense, the fixed mount, usually made for aircraft variant, and the flexible mount, HB, or heavy-barreled variants, which would end up being used for almost everything, including aircraft, albeit with changed-out barrels simply because you didn't need heavy barrels in these guns. In addition to this, you could also put flex-mount guns in bubble turrets, individually manned turrets, and the like. The former two used a much lighter profile barrel because the water and air would provide adequate or completely neutral heat sinks. The heavy barrel, or the HB variant, on the other hand, was an air-cooled variant, so it used a much stiffer profile barrel to absorb as much heat as possible, delaying the need for barrel changes. And in addition to this, troops on the ground would develop their own tactics to attempt to adequately keep the guns cool under sustained use. But in order to properly understand this, we need to understand how this machine gun works a little bit. The M2 is a closed-bolt, recoil-operated machine gun, which is not terribly uncommon for the time. What is uncommon for the time is the machine gun's modularity, which does in fact add great flexibility to the system, but it also poses its individual challenges. To best understand this, we need to understand what headspace and timing is. Headspace being the critical distance between the firearm's bolt face and the chamber's reference point that stops a cartridge from going further forward, and timing, which for automatic recoil-operated firearms is the adjustment and moving components that ensures that ignition of a cartridge only takes place when its moving components are in the fully forward locked position. Now, the reason why I trundle out these definitions is that unlike most small arms of this era where your headspace and timing is fully assembled and fixed from the factory, which means machine guns have a tendency to be shipped with a set or pair of barrels that were gauged and approved to work with this machine gun in particular, and with timing that is not adjustable, or in the case of the 1919 machine gun, the barrels would not be changed on the line at all because of mechanical complexity. The M2 instead would need to be properly headspace and timed for the particular activity it was involved in based on who was using it after the gun arrived, meaning you have to mount up the barrel, then use a headspace and timing gauge to properly and safely mount the barrel to each gun. And while this allows for the gun to be used anywhere, this poses specific and noteworthy challenges to the most common ground-based M2s, which would be the HB, as removing the barrel is a process that massively exposes the troop if you're in a bad enough fight. And while soldiers themselves would just set and leave the timing on their particular barrels and would learn how to eyeball their headspace in a pinch, the barrel itself would still have to be unscrewed, removed from the front of the gun, which is huge and really hot, then a new one would have to be screwed in, and with ratchet ticks somehow be able to feel, not hear because you're an M2 guy and can't hear anything now, the correct number of ticks required to properly headspace the barrel to the gun in a gunfight that requires the aid of one or multiple 50 caliber machine guns. And even with ways to eyeball this headspace, this is a quick and fast way to make sure that soldiers and Marines avoid doing this as much as possible, both with techniques that were learned by line officers and the NCOs that made the suggestions in the first place, and new additions to those techniques via quirks in the design itself. What do I mean by this? Well, the M2 itself has two firing modes, a single shot that's not semi-auto, or full auto. In the single shot mode, running your action in the rear locks the bolt to the rear until released by this big old button right here. So in addition to getting a pretty solid 0 for extreme distance shooting with your traverse and elevation, or T and E, that's mounted to your tripod, hopefully, you can also use this to keep the heat down on the gun, or at least try. So when used in combination with controlling the burst rate and volume, talking between pairs or quartets of machine guns, that's you firing your burst after the adjacent gun finishes theirs, taking 100-round belts and halving them to 50 during the summer, forcing more reloads, or leaving them at 100 during the fall or winter, and on the reload, pointing the gun skyward, attempting to smokestack a little bit, using the AG to open the feed tray cover before the gunner locks the action to the rear, and then waiting on the AG to load the new belt into the ghost charge position before then closing the feed tray cover, then closing the action, setting the gun back into full auto, charging the gun again, and continued talking with other guns. Trained, disciplined M2 crews can inflict sustained ass whipping for what feels like a month for those that are on the receiving end. This, again, by the way, is in addition to the fact that the simple nature of this new and immediately useful technology would make it easy to be whatever you wanted it to be, the potential of which was easily recognized by our allies that found themselves beset by a sea of spicy pinwheel-wearing assholes led by a guy in a stupid mustache in 1939. We would also develop a similar understanding a couple years later and onward as a bunch of dumb assholes crossed the Pacific screaming about honor and dumb shit like that while also acting like the evilest people on the planet in December of 1941. But even before war with these two major adversaries would begin in earnest, the M2 was already making its way into every corner of military service and was desired by people the closer this war actually got. Never mind when it actually got here. Touching the boats on December 7th spurred America's incredibly competitive capitalist market and industry into the single thing that every mortal man on the planet fears. And for the Axis powers, this meant a single thing. All of us agree. We're gonna set aside all of our differences for a single purpose, making you die. And so, America, a continent-sized nation with all of its available resources and human capital, got started, standing up and getting to work an entire nation for the express purpose of making war across an entire planet. Thing is, though, is America is not just interested in drowning their enemy in stuff. America and her war planners at the time were expressly interested in sending in qualitatively better equipment than what was on hand and available to her enemies, because of its ability to innovate easily afar from exploding cities. These leaders at the time knew that they needed to send vast quantities of food, medical, and war material a long way that needed to be properly supported logistically. Massive quantities of small arms, ammunition, and the best vehicles of the war, both in theater-scale performance and ability to repair them, in other words, the Deuce and a Half, Jeep, and the Sherman tank, would be needed to be shipped across oceans to get into the fight. And while over time there would be claims to the contrary by people who have no capacity to read, comprehend, or got their knowledge base straight and exclusively from the History Channel, these were but a few examples of many that would be by far the best examples of military hardware during the war. Side note, before people start this nonsense that like to be contrarian morons in the comments, the Panther tank was an unreliable pile of garbage that killed itself more than we killed it. All of the Tiger variants were very large, slow to move, easy to hit with artillery, and were quite mortal against all variants of the Sherman from considerably longer distance than people like to actually admit, that also had electrical wiring that was so bad that many could lose important connections from deflected hits that didn't harm the tank otherwise, never mind the fact that America deployed the Sherman tank in 5 to 6 tank platoons. German armor as a whole was deployed intelligently on only a bare few war-losing handful of occasions, and this is before people started to cram light artillery pieces into Shermans to more or less prove the point that it could be done. The Germans themselves based an entire supply chain designed to defeat the planet on fucking horses, and the Japanese had tanks that could only be described as tin-plated jokes that moved on treads. If you don't like facts, you shouldn't pretend like you have any in the first place. Moving on. The M2 in its own right is commonly, confusingly, overlooked as a war-winning asset during this war, which is a damn shame considering it was mounted en masse on every single vehicle that could take it. This is not in jest, as literally everything with a pintle mount and had the guns on hand would have one mounted to it on the ground. Every single tank, light tank, tank destroyer, an enormous number of jeeps, every single cargo truck in a supply convoy, if it could be done, every single bomber, fighter, light boat, naval vessel, fucking submarine, every established line, static or shifting, had many laced across them, every advance was covered in part by them, newly captured territory would first find a way to emplace them, then heavier mortars, so that ground could be held for follow-on forces to establish more permanent positions, and of course, with all the places it went, it also created an enormous number of field variants that people used to leverage the might of this heavy small arm. Most of these field variants would more or less start to look like a contest on who could get the most linked up at once, but the most commonly used was the Dual 50 and the Quad 50, both of which were initially created to be a ground-based method of self-defense against aircraft, but as many officers would hazard to mention, the difference between aircraft clearing equipment and infantry clearing equipment generally depends on who exactly is driving the half-track. Further still, even in its early days, this would spur crazy people into trying, we'll call it interesting, ways to implement the design. As more or less a footnote, before the war even started, the US cavalry would attempt to make a semi-auto, shoulder-fired, belt-fed version of the original 1921, complete with a traditional pistol grip and a prismatic sight, with eye relief that required the rather brave troop using it to be 2 inches from the sight itself. It was further modified extensively after this initial development into something that sort of worked and resembled an inbred version of the 1933 M-2. This concept was rightfully abandoned before the war started because it was slower to set up, slower to use, and would ultimately end up even heavier to carry around because nothing broke down. They'd simply be assembled into this thing, and unlike the machine guns, it could not be separated into sections, meaning barrel, tripod, and receiver. That said, it would only be a historical footnote that was completely forgotten if the semi-auto 50 caliber thought virus would ever leave the minds of Americans, because in reality, it just didn't. We're just kind of like that here. The thing is, though, is saying that a thing exists and listing a huge number of variants simply isn't enough to do it justice, nor is it enough to say that it was successful. After all, there were about 1 million variants to the Pontiac Grand Prix, and nobody who's ever driven one of those had their shit together while they were driving it, including the car itself. So the best way to describe the M2 and its effect on a small or theater-scale battlefield was to describe the impact that it had on the enemy it faced, one separated limb and torso at a time. Opposite to the Black Hawk Down movie, a snap means it's close. A hiss, or really a zip with the letter W attached, means that they're shooting at you and getting really close. Because if it's close to your head, you can literally hear it tearing through the air. The thing about the M2, though, is that this is, in fact, a small cannon. Being fired on by a high-velocity 50 sounds like you're being chased by the husky guy in your unit that's secretly super fast. There's nothing subtle about it. Feels like a runaway subway car is approaching you, and this is all the more terrifying when you find out that you, individually, are the target. Something else to note is that machine guns, especially compared to modern concepts of semi-auto rifle and pistol reliability, are historically incredibly unreliable, even to the modern day. There are a ton of very small parts that need to work very well. All of them wear out rather quickly, relatively speaking. Belts themselves, whether disintegrating or not, are a source of frustration, or if it's the fall or spring psychosis, and unlike rifles, most machine guns will not run until the gun explodes. More often than not, it'll run until something small snaps, at which point the gun will abruptly tell you to fuck off. And in the case of the M2, economy of scale works in its favor, because even the small parts are not so small. Recoil operation effectively runs the system reliably, as there is a ton of recoil energy, and so a small cannon trying to play the part of machine gun that you could time to basically whatever speed that you want, it runs very reliably, all things considered. And this includes the modern day. So now imagine being a spicy pinwheel wheelman trundling about with your machine gun platoon that's spotted an American supply convoy. You're first, in fact, and honestly, it's quite small, so you should be able to hit it quite well. You know that Americans depend on endless supplies, so trying to hamper this is at least a small victory. So your platoon decides to hit the convoy from the right flank. You wait for the right moment to reveal yourselves, and when it comes, the MG-42s open up. You've heard its terrifying 1100 round per minute cadence of fire many times up to this point, and you're sure of the fear it induces. You know what you've been told of Americans. You have absolutely no fear of your enemy's inferior equipment and total confidence in yours. When suddenly, half the guns in that convoy turn in your direction, and you hear it for the first time. Dozens of explosions at once. Not gunshots, followed by the convoy's willingness to stop and use these cannons as a base of fire for the 2 light Stuart tanks that were in the column to start maneuvering on you. Very shortly thereafter, other small arms fire opens up at once with these small cannons, and you realize that this small supply convoy overmatches your entire platoon, and effortlessly so. You turn to your squad leader to see what he wants you to do to discover he's been hit, and you've seen people get hit before, but not like this. A simple machine gun hit him in the hip, and instead of him just falling over, the projectile hit him on an angle inboards towards the torso, but you don't notice that because it bisected him. Immediately after thinking of retreat, others start getting hit, each time taking a wound or losing a limb that you instantly know is infixable. By now, the Stuarts are getting closer, adding their lighter machine guns and actual cannons to a fight you know you can't win. Your platoon has to make a hasty retreat, wounded badly and missing a lot of its original strength, and then it suddenly dawns on you that if their supply convoys are this heavily armed, what chance do you really stand when this army's real might gets turned towards your home? In the air, it's not going well for Germany either. The Americans had figured out that sending fighter escort with their bombers, never mind long-range fighters with their bombers, is now just the way to go. So in addition to the bombers providing a more than prickly target to your dwindling fighter force, you're now faced with the prospect of fighter aircraft that have 6 to 8 of these things in their wings. In addition, you know that your fighters are armed with 2 different types of machine guns generally, a regular rifle grade set and a low velocity 20mm cannon, which means you have to manage 2 different velocities. The 20mm is devastating, but it has to actually hit what you're shooting at, and the lower muzzle velocity makes it more difficult to use. Whereas instead, the American fighters have more power than you do. All of their guns really hurt everything you put up in the sky, and for some reason you never see the telltale signs of jamming. Eventually, because of this overall might, you can't keep up enough air resistance to keep the bombing raids away. Watching high explosive and incendiary bombs hit your homes, it creates more than a concerning picture. The situation on the ground for the Japanese got no less concerning. For instance, in the Battle of Peleliu, imagine yourself as a Japanese troop on the ground on the island. You haven't been told very much about the war's progress, although you're certain you're winning, even though you know that the Empire is losing ground. Your officers are confident of their defense of the island. They tell you that with the defenses they have in place, it'll take the Americans over a century to beat back the defenses of this place. And before the battle even starts, you receive days on days of naval gunfire beating the brakes off of the island itself, with the very few breaks in that naval gunfire immediately being laced by consistent and accurate airstrikes. You notice right away that the air cover that you have for the island is being swept aside easily, and wonder why it is that very shortly after combat breaks out with the American planes, your vaunted Zeros and their honorable pilots suddenly are exploding. You even notice faintly on the ground that a Zero gets a perfect position on a US Navy Hellcat, fires on it, and nothing happens. But it's all good. If they land troops, this is the opportunity to kill Americans, what you've been wanting to do since this thing started. Plus, you know there's a hidden stock of tanks that have been performing very well in China and even against the Russians up to this point, so they should be more than a match for whatever armored force these inferior piles of garbage bring ashore. And then the landings begin. Your forces start to be pushed back across the airfield that you were set to defend. You've managed to stiffen up your resistance, and the Americans seem to have stopped. Attempting to take the airfield seems to be a tall order for these people, and so the order is given to your tank forces to attack. You know that they're only lightly set up, and your tank forces stand a real good chance of overrunning their presently being established positions. You know that your tank crews are among the elite in your fighting force. They have tons of combat experience up to this point, and have their own tank kills to to their name. The armored crews roll forward, knowing that they are going to make progress, and hopefully if they catch American armor by surprise, they can push them back into the sea, when suddenly and abruptly your tank crews start receiving machine gun fire of all things. What could they possibly achieve with machine gun fire? What are they trying to scare us? We're in tanks. Yeah, the mortar fire's picking up, but that's not a big deal. And then you notice a couple of the tanks that are moving forward start to stop. Maybe they're having mechanical trouble. Spare parts, after all, have been a difficult thing to come by. And then more of them stop, and then you start to notice that these machine gun crews are concentrating on the tanks. And that's when you notice the first fire start in the first tank. Their machine gun crews are actually stopping our tanks. How is it possible that small arms are stopping the most elite armored fighting force on the planet? And then you notice that as the tank formations begin to stall out, the explosions start to increase. And that's when you notice the first Sherman tank. A Type 95 turns his turret toward him and is able to get the first shot off. Okay, so at the very least, one of these tanks is going to go down, and maybe this counterattack wasn't a waste. But of course, to the stunned surprise of the tank crew firing on them, they notice that their round harmlessly ricochets off of sloped armor, and now that Sherman knows where they are, it fires its main cannon, lifting the turret of the Hago in the air. And that's when it dawns on everyone present that the Americans are concentrating their fire on the armor and picking off the infantry that's trying to support the attack. The mortars get heavier, and this is the moment that you know you've lost. And see, the thing is that as far as the Japanese military is concerned, this exact thought process, this scene played out multiple times because they were not given pertinent information about America's true capabilities. Even all the way back to the Philippines, their light tanks would get stopped by M2s in their tracks, more or less proving that if the M2 was made in time for and then deployed during World War I, they would have absolutely mopped the floor with armored vehicles of that era. But in this era, the modern one, being able to mobility, mission, or outright kill armored vehicles with a simple small arm that infantry deploy, and the stunned realization by the Japanese that the armor that they were deploying was completely inadequate for purpose, much like most things they were deploying during the war at the time, followed by the systematic grinding down of their forces and eventually home country, was, as far as morale goes, utterly crushing, and that they couldn't fight back. They couldn't push Americans away. They couldn't even really reverse progress once it was made, most of the time, because once Americans had established their positions, they would employ M2s in every available position they could, making it basically impossible to advance on them in counterattacks. And of course, this played out much the same way for the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge being one of the very best examples of this, because Mustache Man decided to consolidate as much armored fighting power as possible with supporting infantry into one place, the Ardennes Forest, desperately doing anything he could to push back the Allies, and while able to achieve some success because of the surprise afforded him, a great many Americans, with merely the small arms they had in place, were able to delay, stall out, and eventually push back the Germans. One of the most famous uses of a single M2 in history came from a scrawny guy that did so much damage to so many Germans with one gun that he was immortalized forever. And of course, those of you that are watching this and know anything about history at all, or have ever served in the United States Army, know exactly who this is. And look, there were a great many factors that contributed to the Allies' success and winning of the Second World War. Something that I wish to highlight is one of the bigger reasons for that was the most commonly produced cruise-served fixed position or vehicle-mounted machine gun that greatly overmatched every adversary it came across in this category. And while it could be certainly overmatched by a nearby tank or artillery piece or mortar tube, there was nothing that you shouldered and fired bullets out of that could counter it effectively, especially when it was deployed in volume. But of course, World War II was not the only place that the M2 would distinguish itself. Whether it's Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Desert Storm, Lebanon, Iraq again, Afghanistan, or Syria, the M2 followed our guys to them all. And in every single one of these conflicts, it proved as a place that the enemy could go no further, more or less sending a message that was not subtle in the least by saying, if you are going to attack us and try to overrun a position, you better bring a whole lot more than people generally would, because 50 caliber machine guns are present, and the guys that you bring to this gunfight had better be real hard, because they're gonna see some things they've never imagined before in the realm of human suffering. What's even more interesting about this is that the 50 BMG in and of itself would spawn a very long list of derivatives and individual rifles that people would try to leverage, because some guy a long time ago proved that you could make a semi-auto rifle with this fucking caliber. Rifles such as the Accuracy International AS-50, the Barrett M82, which would turn into the M107, the Barrett M95, a bolt-action bullpup 50, because if you're bored with rifle designs, just bullpup it, which later on developed the Barrett M99, a single-shot, extremely accurate 50. The entire Gepard anti-material rifle series that the Hungarian military decided to get interested in. The Macmillan TAC 50 that was used by the most polite country on earth to achieve the longest confirmed sniper kill in history. The Steyr HS-50. And even the damn Serbians got involved with the M93 Black Arrow. And while there are certainly more accurate extreme distance rifle calibers out there, very few of them hit with the engine block dislodging authority of 50 BMG. But of course, rifles weren't the only thing that were made from its caliber. There were also numerous 50 BMG machine guns that were made based off of the M2's overall design, none of which are truly successful, because turns out it takes a lot of good math to self-contain a small cannon. But a notable example of someone trying to ratchet up the retard is the Gao-19, because somebody noticed that after the Korean War, the 50 fell out of aircraft service in favor of a 20mm Vulcan cannon. And seeing as this is now a ground-based weapon, why not just give it a rotary electrical device, and then bolt it onto things like Little Birds, so people can get introduced to armor-piercing, high-explosive incendiary in the form of angry bee sounds. The Gao-21 is a naval development by just taking the M2 and asking, what if we could ratchet up the rate of fire on this to 1,000 rounds per minute and stick it in the side of Blackhawks with a big-ass World War II era anti-aircraft sight on it, because nothing mulches infantry like anti-aircraft guns. But all the while, the basic M2 persisted in its original format, amidst all the small arms that came and went, amidst all of the famous counterparts it fought in World War II with vanishing sans de 1911, which is a pistol. And pistols don't really win wars. It persisted in this original format and maintained itself as the primary heavy small arms for the entire United States military. Hell, the tripod and T&E didn't change either until 2010, when a brand new 50 caliber machine gun was adopted. It utilized interrupting threads on its barrel so it could be quickly changed, much like a 240 Bravo or Mag 58 for my European friends. And the barrel itself came with a gigantic flash suppressor, because why not? And this brand new 50 caliber machine gun that would rapidly begin to supplant all the M2s in our inventory is the M2A1. Literally the same design, we just made it a little bit more convenient. And oh, by the way, in 2014 we'll introduce a lighter tripod that works basically exactly the same, but we'll throw in the T&E as an included part of the tripod so that you don't have to hunt yours down anymore. Which is a hell of a statement, because if the only answer that you have to your product is your product again, that's more or less a great way to ensure its dominance. Because in the modern day, the way that the M2A1 is typically employed is very much the same as it was before. Only now there are a couple more extremely violent surprises that people are noticing rapidly. Because now, not only is it a ground-based system that can be mounted into whatever it is that you want, it can also be hooked up to a CROWS system, which is vehicle or ground-based, is capable of tracking you, automatically doing the math, and hitting you with with armor-piercing high-explosive incendiary from well over a mile, and this includes whether or not you're on the ground or flying through the air. It would seem that the M2 in and of itself hasn't quite escaped the technological age either, in that systems involved in particularly targeting computers are very well honed for and have a great understanding of the M2's capabilities and performance. And so we bring ourselves to the end of the M2 story, at least for now, because at the end of the day, the M2 is a story of violent overmatch, excessive noise, no considerations for reasonable weight constraints, game-changing doodads, or victory through finesse. The M2 is a direct statement, a loud, defiant voice in the ever-evolving landscapes that began with steam power, lived through depression, war, the rise and death of a communist empire, the space age, the birth of the technological age, and the age of information. The Ma-Deuce is a domestically produced weapon system that has lived through the entire life cycle of nations and laid low the ambitions of tyrants, all the while occasionally reminding us that war is not a game of whimsical ideas, but the application of extreme violence. And those that forget that may one day decide that they may need an M2 crew or two to remind them of the reality that they face, because at the end of the day, those who use this incredibly powerful piece of military hardware have always been willing to provide an answer when you ask the doomed question starting with, you in what army? Because at the end of the day, when you send that bolt home and touch off those butterflies, that answer is typically enough.